Hey everybody, welcome back to the program. Today's episode was inspired by a recent Reddit post. User HeavyMetal23 made a poll on the Beatles subreddit to determine the worst Beatles album by having users vote on the weakest songs from every Beatles record, plus a couple of singles. And I thought it was a great idea, and I wanted to throw my hat into the ring and come up with my own playlist, but one big difference is that I decided not to count any covers. I only looked at original songs by the Beatles. And if I inadvertently pick one of your favorite songs in advance, I'm sorry. This is just for fun. As Beatles fans, I think we can all agree that not every song they wrote and recorded ended up being a smash hit. You know what I mean? There are some songs that, for whatever reason, don't hit as well as the more well-known songs. And so I think of this as sort of a fun way to showcase maybe lesser-known songs or songs that don't get enough airtime, that sort of a thing. You know, give them a little bit more credit, because man, I was surprised how many songs. I call myself a Beatles fan, but there's a lot of songs I kind of skip over, and this sort of forced me to sit down and really listen to some of these other songs. So with all that said, let's break down the 16 tracks that make up my worst Beatles album. Special thanks to Tidal for sponsoring this video. As much as I prefer to listen to music on vinyl, it's not always that practical this day and age, and so I stream a lot of music, but not all services are created equal, especially when it comes to paying royalties. Not only is Tidal one of the top paying per stream, if you subscribe to their Hi-Fi Plus tier, up to 10% of your monthly subscription goes directly to your highest streamed artist. Right now you can get 60 days free, just follow the link below, and when you're there, be sure to listen to my playlist featuring my picks for the worst Beatles album. Thanks again to Tidal. Kicking things off, we have Please Please Me, which is an all-around great debut album, but with 6 cover songs, that leaves only 8 originals to pick from, and I had a hard time. Ultimately, I went with Misery because it's just a clunker. The melody is boring, the drums, bass, and guitar are just doing the minimum, and what kills me is the piano fills. I have a lot of respect for George Martin, but his playing here doesn't really help this song. Plus, John and Paul's vocals feel like they're fighting with each other more than they are in harmony. Moving on to With the Beatles, and right off the bat I eliminated half the tracks since 7 of them were covers. I should also note that George gets his first song on a Beatles album. That being said though, I ended up picking Little Child. Besides how repetitive this song feels overall, what kills this song for me is the harmonica playing. It's just not that great. It has a nearly constant presence, and it takes the place of the guitar solo, and the solo itself is not that great. Up next we have A Hard Day's Night, their first album to feature all original songs, and there are some heavy hitters on this record, from the title track to Can't Buy Me Love, but for me, the weakest song is When I Get Home. It just pales in comparison to the other songs, and while I like the melody during the chorus, overall it feels a bit under tempo, if that makes sense, and ultimately nothing about it really stands out to me. It feels very derivative of this period. Now we've come to probably the most uneven Beatles album, Beatles For Sale. In terms of their discography, this record feels like a step backwards since it contains 6 covers of mostly early rock and roll hits. However, the originals on here are some of the best songs from this period, including No Reply, All Follow the Sun, and 8 Days a Week. But for this video, I had a tough time deciding between Babies in Black and What You're Doing. I really like most of What You're Doing, but that piano during the guitar solo really kills it for me. But in the end, I had to go with Babies in Black because not only does it feel awkward being in a waltz time signature, the guitar solo feels like it belongs to another song. The two just don't really jive for me. The next 3 albums, Help, Rubber Soul, and Revolver, got much harder for me because their songwriting really improved. For each album, I really had to split hairs to figure out my least favorite song. But with all that said, let's start with Help. And already it's an improvement with only 2 covers out of 14 tracks, but yeah, it pains me to do this to George Harrison, but the weakest track for me is You Like Me Too Much. And my issue has less to do with the song and more to do with the arrangement. George Martin's piano really takes center stage here. In fact, it takes the place of the guitar for most of the song, and in my opinion, oversteps the guitar solo. And his playing style feels very stale and rigid, and I don't understand the honky-tonk flourishes he adds. For me, this was a very rare misstep for George Martin. Moving on to Rubber Soul, and we return to an album full of originals, including 2 songs by George Harrison, and this time I had to go with a song co-written by Ringo, the side 2 opener, What Goes On. And don't get me wrong, I like this song, and coming from someone who played a lot of rockabilly when I was younger, I really appreciate the arrangement and the guitar picking, But when you compare it to all the other songs on this album, which is an incredible selection, it just becomes the song that I love the least. You know what I mean? Up next is Revolver, and honestly, there's not a bad song on here, but in the end, I had to go with Dr. Robert because musically, this moves me the least out of all the other tracks. It's not a bad song, and I like it. It's just that Revolver is full of world-class songs, and in comparison, Dr. Robert feels a bit unfinished, or rather underdeveloped, if that makes sense. I will say though that the bridge, or maybe it's considered the chorus, you know, the part where the drums cut out, is fantastic. Alright, from Sgt. Pepper's onwards, this task became incredibly difficult, like Sophie's Choice level, and for this album I went back and forth between two songs, Harrison's Within You, Without You, and the blaring Good Morning, Good Morning. On the one hand, Good Morning has an undeniable Beatles sound to it, but it's rather garish, not unlike an alarm clock. On the other hand, we have Harrison really showcasing his understanding of classical Indian music. However, it really doesn't sound like the Beatles, and that's probably because George is the only Beatle playing on it. Despite this though, I really love how it kicks off side 2 with something unexpected, and for that reason, my pick for the weakest song on Sgt. Pepper's is Good Morning, Good Morning. For Magical Mystery Tour, we are using the LP version, but even if we were to pick from the EP, my choice would still be the same, Flying. It's got a great vibe to it, and I think it's really cool that it's one of the few songs credited to all the Beatles. All the Beatles got writing credit for this song. However, there's no lyrics, there's no vocals, that Beatles charm is missing from it, and then when you compare it to the rest of the songs on this album, some of which are my all-time favorite songs, not just Beatles songs, but all-time favorite songs, it just doesn't hold its own against them. It's not fair. Like any other band making that song, they would be fine, but the Beatles, on a Beatles record, it just sort of gets lost in the shuffle, you know what I mean? With the White Album, we get to pick 2 songs, one from each record, and we're gonna start with Why Don't We Do It in the Road. Again, it's not a bad song, it's simple like Wild Honey Pie, but at least that song is more musically interesting to me. Why Don't We Do It in the Road feels more like a speed bump than a really cool interlude song. Also, the instrumentation feels pretty lifeless in comparison to Paul's energetic vocals. It's probably no surprise that my second pick is Revolution 9, and while I think it's a really cool piece of experimental music and I'm sure it had a huge impact back in 1968, however, on the album, it sticks out like a sore thumb. I enjoy it and I'm glad it exists, but I don't want to listen to it on repeat. So with Yellow Submarine, we have to cut 7 of the 13 tracks as those are credited to George Martin, and that leaves us with 6 Beatles songs. However, 2 of those are repeats, Yellow Submarine from Revolver and All You Need Is Love from Magical Mystery Tour. And it's not like I was going to pick those songs anyway since I love them, so really that leaves us with 4 songs to choose from. And again, I hate to do this to George Harrison, but my pick for the weakest track is Only a Northern Song. It's just another case where I like the other tracks more. Moving on to my current favorite Beatles album, Abbey Road, and again, there's not a bad song on here, so it was very difficult for me to choose Maxwell's Silver Hammer. And I'll admit that I used to hate this song, but I've really come around to it in the last couple of years, and I enjoy the juxtaposition of the lyrics and the music. Again, overall, I like this track, but this was just another case of narrowing it down to my least favorite song. Alright, up next we have the final Beatles album, Let It Be, and for the longest time, this was a record that I largely ignored, but thanks to the incredible Get Back documentary, I've come to really appreciate this album, and I like it so much more now. That being said though, there are still a few clunkers on here, namely the 2 shorter songs, and one of those is a cover of a traditional folk song, and so that just leaves Dig It as my pick for the weakest on the record. And while I like this song within the context of the album on its own, there's just not much to it. It's more of a musical idea than a song. Alright, so the last 2 song picks are non-album tracks, meaning they were only released as singles or on an EP, that sort of a thing. So for simplicity, we're going to pull them from the Past Masters compilation. Now the first song comes from the pre-1966 period, and I ended up picking I Call Your Name. It's an early Beatles song, and it shows. It's not bad, but it really doesn't stand out to me. And probably the most interesting part of it is the bridge, which goes into a ska rhythm, but the transition between the 2 rhythm styles feels very clunky to me. And finally, we have the period from 1966 through the 90s, and I ended up picking You Know My Name, Look Up the Number. And as much as I love the fact that Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones plays sax on here, and the overall playful nature of this track is really cool, I just don't find myself listening to this on repeat. I think it's really cool to show my friends who aren't as familiar with the Beatles output, and like they are blown away. Like they did not know this song existed. But other than that, when you compare it to all the other tracks that came out during this time period, it's just the weakest in my opinion. All right, everybody, that will do it for today. Be sure to let me know your worst Beatles album with a comment down below. I'd love to read those. Until then, thank you all so much for watching. I am your Vinyl Geek, and I'll catch you on the flip side.